Hi, welcome to another video from Project Ride the Pennines. Today we're going to be swapping out a back wheel. Going to show you how to take the wheel out of the frame, out of the dropouts, strip off the cassette, remove the brake rotor and then pop it on another wheel. Maybe you've bought a new wheel and you just want to get on with riding, or maybe like I am, you're taking out a 29er wheel to swap it out for a 27.5. When it's a bit wet and muddy, I like to ride with a slightly wider tyre, and it also lowers the bottom bracket a bit, makes the bike feel a little bit different. You can obviously only do that in frames that are made for that. So let's look at the tools you're going to need for the job. You're going to need a couple of Allen keys, various Allen keys I've got one to take out the axle, and there's one to deal with the brakes afterwards if I need to realign the calipers. You also need a Torx key, a Torx T25 Torx wrench as well to deal with the brake rotor bolts. You'll need a chain whip or chain whip pliers to help you hold the free hub, hold the cassette in the free hub when you're trying to undo it. And then you'll need something to hold the cassette removal tool. So either a set of mole grips or pliers or a wrench. This is a torque wrench, so I can snug it up to the right torque at the end. And I've also got my smaller torque wrench here so that I can get the brake rotors to the correct torque. And obviously you're going to need another wheel, something you're going to replace the other one with. Right, okay, so the first thing you need to do is just to release the pressure, release the tension on the chain by disengaging the rear mech. Pop that button in there and you can actually take the chain off the chain rings. This makes life a little bit easier to move it as far as you can out of the way when you are trying to undo things. So then you need to remove the rear axle. Now on my bike, as you can see here, it's not a quick release. It's a through axle, but it's not a quick release. It's using an Allen key. So just going to crack that off there. And just going to crack that off there. Now the important thing to remember is that when you're doing this, you need to support the weight of the wheel with one hand, because as soon as the axle comes out, the wheel will want to drop down out of the frame. So that's important. Okay, so we get that out. Okay, the wheel wants to drop down. You can hear the bike creaking in the frame, in the stand. As it drops down, we'll just move the derailleur back and out of the way nice and gently, and the wheel now drops out nicely from the frame. So when you're working on your wheel, you're going to need to have it somewhere where you can easily access it, but it's not going to put strain or stress on the either the rotor, bending the rotor, or the cassette. So on the top of a bin, or just open an open plastic box like this, works quite nicely. So the first thing you need to do is crack off the brake disc rotor, loosen off the bolts. They shouldn't be really tight, but you might have used a bit of blue Loctite to keep them secure. Loosen off in a pattern where you go to opposite bolts. There we go. Once they're loose, you can then get the other end of the Torx wrench and just spin those out quite quickly. Having a box underneath is quite useful, because it means if I drop anything, like little bolts or little bits and pieces, it all falls in this empty box and I can easily get it out. You might have seen in one of my other videos, I use a wheel over the top of a bin, which works really well until you drop something. Then you've got to go through all the rubbish in the bin to collect it. So I've moved on to using a plastic storage box on a bench or on a chair here to be able to do that without losing any bits. As you'll have seen from other videos, I'm quite clumsy and I tend to drop bolts and spanners and things, so I'm starting to plan ahead a little bit. So there we go, we got all the bolts out. Get the rotor off. That means the rotor's not going to get bent or damaged in what we're doing. Next thing, let's pop the valve air cap off. Next thing we need to do is to take off the cassette lock ring to be able to release the cassette. This is just a normal Shimano or SRAM slider one. It's not one of the XD driver bodies, so it just would spin. If you wanted to, if you put your cassette lock ring tool in and you're just going to turn it anti-clockwise, the problem here is that the freewheel disengages and you actually spin the wheel. So what you need to do is use the chain whip just gently around the cassette, and that allows you to lock and turn against that. Now for this, taking it off, I just need to be able to get it off. So I'm just going to undo it with the mole grips and the cassette tool. There we go, fairly tight. When I'm doing it up, you'll see when I put this back on, we're actually going to use the torque wrench to be able to get it to the correct torque setting, which is quite tight. It's printed on this cassette lock ring from SRAM. I think it's 40 Newton meters it says, so that's quite tight. So once we've done that, just going to pop the torque wrench out of the way. Now, this cassette is in several pieces. There are the three rings at the back are made of the same piece, so they're all riveted together. The other pieces come out gradually and they've got spaces in between. So once you've taken off the cassette lock ring, you need to take the cassette off. You can do this all in one go, but it's easier and certainly helps you not to drop spaces and things if you take it off one ring at a time and put it down in the order that you took it off. So pop it down, and if there are spaces in between, keep the spaces in the right place. So here we go, just taking those off one at a time, making some space on the bench. You can see now there's a spacer on that already, so taking that off. So I'm just putting these down in the order I take them off, and that means that when I come to put them on, I should get everything back in the right place. Laying them down nicely. I'm just putting on the bench, there's another spacer. I put them in order so they're not on top of each other, and that means I definitely get them all in the right place. So take the last few off. Sometimes they can be quite stiff to come off because they're covered in grime. You can see the space is actually stuck on the top of that one because it's got a bit gungy over time. Sometimes they might be a little bit stiff. You might need to just get a screwdriver under to wiggle it gently, but you've got to be very careful doing that because obviously you don't want to bend the chainring because that'll make your shifting go all kaput and not actually work properly. So just because they're fairly gungy that I've had to do that. Finally, we come to the last piece. As you can see here, there's a slightly bigger spacer there, so that's worth noting that that's the last spacer. And then the whole cassette just lifts off nicely. You've got your one piece there. So this wheel is now ready to go back to storage. And we now need to bring in the new wheel. So the first thing you'll note is that quite a few cassettes have a spacer that just goes behind the final part of the cassette. It's worthwhile remembering where that goes. And you might be able to see on here there's a thinner spline on the top there with a wider gap next to it, and all the others are evenly spaced. And that means that you can line that up with the corresponding gap and indent in the cassette itself, and it means you can get it onto the right place. If you can't see it, you can just feel your way around until it drops over. It won't go over unless it's the right place. So then it comes down to putting the cassette back together in exactly the same order and same way that you took it off. If you're not sure which side of the chainring should face out, it's usually got the number of teeth printed on it here, and that should be facing out. So that helps you also to get that in the right place. So I'm just going to build this back now, not too quickly. Just want to make sure that I'm getting the chain rings facing the right way and that they're actually fitting on the cassette snugly. You can see there, you can actually, I can't see properly because of where the light is, but you can actually see to fit those on quite easily. There we go. It's a slight disadvantage of a 12-speed cassette is you've got several more chain rings to put on than you would normally have. Let's try and do this one more efficiently and look at the start. There we go, that goes in there. So we're not far off now. Takes a while to just spot that. As you come towards the last few of the chain rings, once you get to the point where the cassette is almost at the top of the free hub here, you'll see that the shape of the chain rings actually changes slightly. Not the outer shape, the inner shape. So after this one will be the last one to go on there. Then they start to change shape. So this last one here changes, so it's actually projecting slightly downwards. That's one of the cunning ways that SRAM have engineered you to be able to get certain size cogs and sprockets, and 12 of them for an Eagle system on a regular spline. And then the final chain ring actually almost looks like it's going to sit proud, and it really is very, very lightly slotting over, to the extent that the grooves or the slots in the chainring itself don't go all the way through. They've got a top. So again, getting that to fit in the right place is really important, and you can check that just by rotating and making sure that it doesn't move. Going to put the lock ring back on with the cassette tool, and of course this time it doesn't matter that we're turning clockwise, so we haven't got to hold the cassette because the pulls in the wheel will engage and actually resist that. So we're actually just turning it up, turning it like a normal nut. Now to do it to the correct torque, I'm using my torque wrench here. I've made the settings. The setting is printed on there, it says 40 Newton meters. I've got the correct socket, so I'm going to pop that on. You can hear it doing up quite tightly. I'm holding it against my body, and fairly soon there'll be a click and the wrench will go loose, and that means I've got to that torque. So that's now on nice and tightly. Torque wrench has clicked. What we need to do now is pop the disc rotor back on. So make sure we've cleaned our hands in between those. We don't want to get any grease on the disc rotor. Pop that in, and again, in the same way that you took the bolts out by going opposites, pop them back in up to hand tight. You might want to put a dab of blue Loctite on there. Just do them very much nipped up there, opposites, and then we'll come to tighten them in just a minute. Hope specify the torque settings for the disc rotor bolts should be 5 Newton meters, which is actually not that tight. So you need to be careful not to over tighten them, because otherwise you will either shear off the bolts or you might bend the rotor itself. It's always worth being very careful with brake rotors anyway, because a brake rotor is a bit faffy to fix and sort out. It makes your brakes noisy and makes them rub and your pads wear down. It's generally bad news. So there we go. Get those all hand tight. Just go around making sure they're hand tight, and then we'll come back and we'll go in the pattern of being opposites. Using the torque wrench, change the torque setting so that it's at 5 Newton meters. There we go. You can possibly see that as I put it in. It just clicks gently when I've got to 5. Make sure you've done all of them. You don't want anything falling out. There we go. Pop the dust cap back on, and now we're ready to move back over to the bike to get this put back into the frame. So we're looking to get the wheel aligned. We want to make sure that the axle can go all the way through nice and smoothly. We want to lift this into the dropout. Now, 2 things you've got to watch. Firstly, make sure you hook the chain over, because you need the chain to be on the top of the cassette. And secondly, always helpful to try and ensure you get the disc rotor back inside the caliper. Once you've done that, pop your thru-axle back in. Should go relatively easy. Pop that round. Nip that up. It's got, on my one, it's got it typed on or printed on. It says 10 Newton meters. I'm just going to do it hand tight. Don't want it to come undone, but it's unlikely to do so. I need to pop the chain ring back on, put the chain back on the chain ring, release the tension into the derailleur, give it a quick spin, so it just changes gear happily. There we go. Not doing too badly there. And the final thing, you can hear the brakes rubbing. So what we're going to do is, using the other Allen key, a little bit of a trick with those. You just loosen off or back off the caliper bolts by half a turn or a turn. The caliper becomes loose. I'm just going to spin the wheel round, pedal the wheel round, pull on the brakes, keep the brake lever held, or we just gently do these back up. There we go. Get them to equal tension. And then There we go, wheel spins perfectly with no noise whatsoever. So if you like this video, please click that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. I'll see you again.